Hello, we are going to talk to you today about the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. I'm going to go over a brief history of the site and its development, and as we go through the rest of the PowerPoint, we'll focus on important dates. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor and the United States entered World War II, the U.S. Army began looking for land to create a chemical manufacturing center. Located just north of Denver in Commerce City and close to the Stapleton Airport, the U.S. Army purchased around 20,000 acres. The location was ideal not only because of the proximity to the airport, but because geographical features of the site, it was thought to be less likely to be attacked. The Rocky Mountain Arsenal manufactured chemical weapons including mustard gas, napalm, white sulfurous, lewisite, and chlorine gas and sarin gas. In the early 1960s, the U.S. Army began to lease out facilities to private companies to manufacture pesticides. In the early 1980s, the site was selected as a Superfund site and the cleanup process began. In the mid-1980s, wildlife, including endangered species, moved into the space and the land became a protected park. The U.S. Army discovered the bald eagle, and after the bald eagles were captured, tested, and found to be healthy, the National Wildlife Federation worked with policymakers to transition the RMA to a wildlife refuge. Policy implications. So with the environmental movement beginning in the United States between the 1960s and the 1970s, the U.S. Congress responded to that movement with a series of legislation and policies. We are mostly going to be focusing on the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, also known as the Superfund, and the Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge Act. In the 1980s, tensions arose between the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the state of Colorado, United States Army, and the chemical industries as they partnered to clean up the site and create the wildlife refuge. This led the state of Colorado to take legal action over who has legal authority over the RMA's remediation efforts, payment of natural resource damages, and the reimbursement costs expended for cleanup activities. Established by Congress in 1992, the Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge Act, the areas within RMA that were still contaminated were still owned by the U.S. Army. However, the vast majority of the land was deemed clean and would be managed by the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service.
So there are plenty of environmental exposures that we need to discuss because the Rocky Mountain Arsenal was originally established to manufacture chemical weapons for use by the U.S. Army in World War II. Eventually, the land was subleased to Shell Oil Company, who used the land to manufacture agricultural pesticides. So there's a lot of environmental implications here. Over 600 chemicals were produced at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, including various pesticides, various insecticides, organic solvents, including dioxin, feedstock chemicals, heavy metals, asbestos, polychlorinated biphenyls, and chemical warfare materials, including sarin gas, mustard gas, and rocket fuel. Many of the chemicals produced on site were produced to cause harm. Sarin gas, for instance, is a highly dangerous compound that was used as a deadly nerve agent in World War II. Not only were the chemicals produced on the arsenal dangerous, the cleanup and disposal of the various chemicals throughout their creation were not effective. Eventually, the soil contamination, groundwater contamination, and air pollution were found to be hazardous to the surrounding vegetation and were causing premature death to the surrounding wildlife. So there was contamination in the soil, biota, groundwater, lake bed sediments, sewers, surface waters, ditches, and wildlife. The groundwater contamination included contamination in the alluvial water aquifer, as well as the South Platte River. The Army constructed basins on the arsenal to dispose of the liquid waste in the unlined basin, but the basins were unlined. Additionally, they used a deep well injection method, though this resulted in subsequent earthquakes in the Denver area. Eventually, the site was placed on the National Priorities List and designated a Superfund site in 1984 with a hazardous risk score of negative 58.15. Cleanup of the site continued through September of 2010. The cleanup of the site included removal of contaminated soil down to about 10 feet deep, intrusion-proof landfill basins, water treatment of contaminated groundwater, and land use restriction implementations. The site continues to be monitored today by the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. Because of the groundwater contamination, many of the communities and neighborhoods surrounding the Rocky Mountain Arsenal are provided with potable tap water from other areas of Adams County. In 1975, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment ordered Army and Shell to stop the non-permitted discharge of contaminants to control the contaminated groundwater leaving the site and to implement a monitoring plan. Remedial actions included a groundwater barrier system, closure of the deep well injection in 1985, and Basin F closure in 1988, which was the most contaminated basin at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. According to the National Resource Damage Assessment, although the contamination has been reduced by the treatment efforts, the water in and around the arsenal may never be fully clean. Approximately 52,000 acre-feet alluvial aquifer is not usable for human consumption. The NRDA found severe injuries to the area wildlife. Death of many birds and mammals, including 20,000 ducks, died in a 10-year span. Hundreds of waterfowl, mallard carcasses, birds, badgers, and prairie dogs suffered injuries. Other species may have suffered reduced reproduction rates or chemically induced paralysis and birth defects. Some of the health implications include soil contamination, water quality, and air pollution. As part of the cleanup of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, much of the soil up to 10 feet below the surface was removed from the site. The soil is contained in hazardous waste landfills, and contaminated areas of soil remain in the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, but are contained in basins and containment structures. Now the soil is considered safe for recreation, but is not considered safe for agricultural use. Many of the surrounding neighborhoods have provided with potable tap water from other areas of Adams County because of the potential effects of contaminated groundwater from wells. Trace amounts of the chemical 1,4-dioxin has been found in some samples of the drinking water. There's no appropriate standard by the EPA, but the state of Colorado has a standard treatment protocol for this chemical, as 1,4-dioxin is listed in the Clean Air Act as a volatile and hazardous potential concern. During the cleanup of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, concern for air pollution and the hazardous materials from the hazardous materials was raised. The Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment established a monitoring system throughout various locations of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. Throughout the decades of the cleanup, the air monitors revealed there was no safety hazard to the public, as no arsenal chemicals had been released into the air. CDPHE performed 2 studies examining the epidemiologic impact of living near the arsenal on birth defect risk and cancer risk. CDPHE found no increased risk of birth defects in infants after completion of the study. Additionally, the study of cancer incidence by the CDPHE did not find any convincing evidence of increased cancer risk in people living in residential areas surrounding the arsenal, though there are some limitations in these studies that we'll discuss further. Additionally, studies performed at Colorado State University found no increased risk of arsenic, mercury, or neurotoxicity in communities within 15 miles of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal. So public concern regarding the cleanup itself resulted in a state and federally funded medical monitoring program. 2 large-scale epidemiological studies were conducted to reassure the public. The surveillance for birth defects failed to detect differences between the communities surrounding the Rocky Mountain Arsenal and others in Colorado during the cleanup period. However, as we suggested, there were many limitations in the study design, including large demographic shifts in the area, indeterminate exposures, lack of true baseline data, and inconsistencies in reporting accuracy and overall paucity of understanding of the causal pathways that may lead to dysgenesis or other health effects from the site contamination. A second study was designed to detect the differences in cancer incidence in the communities surrounding the Rocky Mountain Arsenal and other communities in Colorado. Many of the limitations approximated those of the birth defect studies. Additionally, a higher prevalence of smoking and obesity in the area further confounded the study results. The study of health and environmental effects is limited by current knowledge, and the impact of activities at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal on health and environment continue to evolve. One such medically relevant chemical byproduct is DIMP, a byproduct of sarin gas production. Initial animal studies failed to prove that the chemical was unsafe, but reanalysis years later showed that the physiology of red blood cells had been altered in a way that placed particular risk on pregnant and lactating female subjects. Better understanding of the risk resulted in changes in acceptable levels in drinking water. So some of the ongoing challenges and future solutions of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal are vast. Water, air, soil, and soil contamination is a concern. As a consequence, wildlife and neighboring residents may be in danger. The cost of cleaning the arsenal was about $2 billion initially and continued to be about $5 million annually up until about September of 2010, when the site was deemed clean. It is believed that indirect environmental and social costs could be several times the cost of the cleaning itself. This kind of chemical contamination is impossible to clean, and it may leave a trace on the earth for many, many years. The real effect of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal contamination may fully be never known. But there have been some policy changes due to conflict between the federal and state government. Continued scientific progress in the field of toxicology will allow a better understanding of potential health impacts of the chemical products persisting at the site. All right, and thank you.